Well, Christmas is supposed to be about the feels, right? I was sitting in my living room last night, and the Christmas tree was lit up, and there's a fire in the fireplace going, and the candles were burning, and you could smell the candles all have like the winter pine tree smell. And I was just sitting there taking it in, and the dog was lying there on the floor, and it was just like, oh, this just feels great. The fact that the three kids that are supposed to be there, that used to be there, weren't there. But otherwise, it was still good. And when I think about Christmas, it has all of these different feels, and maybe the traditions that you've done as a family or the traditions that you have as a family. I can remember for many years, we would pack up the kids, and we would go out, and this was when we lived in South Bend, and we would go out to the Christmas tree farm, and then we would hop on the wagon with the big horses, and they would pull us out to the fields, and we cut down our tree, and they'd load it up on the wagon for us, and we'd come back and have hot chocolate and different things like that. We never found any place once we moved to Michigan here where they would take us on a wagon ride, but we still would go off and find our Christmas tree, and we would cut it down, and we'd bring it in, and we would set that up and hang all the ornaments, and you're probably like this too, like we have some of the ornaments that just kind of collect from wherever, but a lot of the ornaments are ones that we specifically bought for different events or different kids or different things that have happened in life, and you hang those up, and there's those memories, and wow, it just has that feel, doesn't it? Or maybe when we talk about Christmas feels, where you sense it is when you're sitting there in the living room and the kids come down, or you remember when the kids came down and they'd see all the presents underneath the tree and their eyes would just light up and be like, oh, there was so much excitement there, and everybody was in their matching pajamas. Maybe that's not part of the feels, I don't know. But you would eat your cinnamon rolls, or maybe it's making cookies, or maybe it's going outside and playing in the snowman. But it's getting the entire family together. And that's when the feels happen, except when we get the entire family together, and then maybe all bets are off, because like there's that Christmas family party where everybody who's related in any way, shape, or form gets invited, and you all gather in one house, and you don't fit to start with, and then you're crammed in there next to the next person, and then, everything starts to fall apart because somebody makes a snarky comment, or one of the aunts goes off on a tirade, or one of the kids gets into a fight with one of the cousins, or one of the uncles who's always inappropriate decides that's the moment that he's going to be inappropriate. Yeah, and the whole thing just kind of fades, the feels are gone, at least the happy feels. Maybe the feels that you get aren't those such good feels. But family can be a bit of a challenge at Christmas. And sometimes I think we feel like, Christmas would be better if I could just cut this one person out of the family. Like I didn't have to worry about what gift to get them, or I don't have to worry about inviting them to the party, or, it would just be easier if maybe they took a trip to Europe this year for Christmas and we didn't have to deal with it. Whatever the case may be, there are those people in the family that you wouldn't necessarily want to invite to Christmas. But there's some people in the Christmas story who got invited as well, that if you and I looked at that, we'd be like, I'm not sure I would invite that person to Christmas. And I'm not talking about being invited to the manger, like where the shepherds were invited, or where the angels were there on the hillside, or eventually how the wise men got there. That's not the invitation I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people who were invited to not the Christmas manger, but the Christmas story. And their names show up in Matthew chapter 1, and I want to encourage you to turn there, Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1 is the story of Christmas told by Matthew, but he doesn't start with the angel coming to Mary, or he doesn't start with the angels in the sky, or he doesn't start with the shepherds, or like Luke does, he doesn't start with the decree of Caesar Augustus. He starts with a list of people who were all ancestors of Mary and ancestors of Christ, and he talks about this family tree. But on this family tree are people that you might not want to invite to the family party. So let's read them, and let's identify them when their names come up. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah, he was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Aminadab. Aminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, he was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. And she's not mentioned by name, but of course there we're talking about Bathsheba. And then we get down to verse number 16. And Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who was called the Messiah. So this is the pedigree of Jesus, but there's these questionable people that are included here. And what's interesting about some of these, there's more than 4, but 4 of the questionable characters that are included are outsiders. They're outsiders to the story, and they're outsiders to the story for at least 3 different reasons. First of all, they're gender outsiders. This is a man's list, and this was how the Jews would have passed on genealogy, and they paid a lot of attention to who the fathers were. But these are the mothers of Jesus. So they were gender outsiders. They were also racial outsiders. 3 of these 4 women were not Jews. The 4th one we're not sure about, but she was married to somebody who was not a Jew as well. So it's possible that all 4 of these that are included in this lineage here of Jesus are not Jews. So they're gender outsiders, they're racial outsiders, but they're also moral outsiders, because 3 of these 4 had a significant scandal or a significant moral failure that was part of their story, and yet all of them were included in the line of Christ. So the question is why? Why include them when it would have been so easy just to leave them out? Sorry, we're not including women in this list. It's just a man's list. Or, sorry, we're not including non-Jews in this list. This is just a Jewish list. Or, sorry, we're not including, people who have really messed up in this list. This is the Jesus list over here, and we know that he was perfect. So why do we include them when including them is just going to draw attention to their stories? It's not like they just kind of get slipped in here, and if we read real fast, hopefully nobody will notice. It could have just been done that way. There was no reason to include them, no requirement for that. And by including them, then their stories are brought to the forefront. And so we start out talking about this first one, Tamar. And to be honest, her story might be the worst of them. And she might seem like the most unlikely person to be in the line of Christ. But God includes her story in all of the sordid details. So yes, first of all, gender, she was a woman. Secondly, race, well, she was a Canaanite. And thirdly, she committed sexual immorality. Now, her story is told in Genesis chapter 38. And so we go all the way back to the early parts of the Old Testament to pick up and to learn what her story was. But let me just tell you a couple things, share a couple things to start with that will set the table for us a little bit. As we go back to the Old Testament was very primitive. And we get back all the way into Genesis, we're actually before even the giving of the law. And so the relationship with man and God is a little bit harder for us to discern and to pick out. But these are kind of crude and crass and sometimes uncivilized by barbaric things that we read about. But it's just telling us what is, or what was, I guess you could say, not necessarily what is supposed to be. And so we also see society working within its rules and regulations. They weren't necessarily given by God. It's just kind of what they put together. And so there's not necessarily even comment sometimes in the Old Testament whether something was right or wrong. It's just like, this is what is. For instance, okay, in the Old Testament we see slavery quite a bit. That's not a comment like, oh, this is fine, or no, this is wrong. It just says, this is what is. Now we would say, obviously that's wrong, but that's what was going on back then. Polygamy was another thing that you saw in the Old Testament. We would call that wrong today. It was just presented sometimes as, here's a what is that's in the Old Testament. There are other practices too. The law of primogeniture. which is the idea that the inheritance is passed down to the firstborn son. That was part of the Old Testament too. And if you're not a firstborn or not a son, that's probably not real exciting to you. It's not really commented on one way or the other. It's just this is what's done. Arranged marriages. That was something that you saw a lot too. Probably nobody in here wants to sign up for that one. But again, it's just like here are how things were, not necessarily here are how things are supposed to be. And then we come across in this story another custom or expected practice, and it's called the levirate law. And levirate is actually a Latin word. It's not a Bible word. It's a Latin word that means husband's brother or brother-in-law. But the idea of levirate law was this, that if a man married a woman and then he died without having children, or a son specifically, then if he had a brother, that brother was required to marry his widow. And the idea was that this would keep the line, the lineage in place there. And again, this is just what was. So this is, all of these things are like descriptive rather than prescriptive, but they have a part in this story that we're about to read, or actually it's a story that I'm going to tell. And partly I'm going to tell it because it's kind of a sordid story. And so we don't want to go into all the nitty-gritty details, but we can catch enough of it as we go. And so the story in Genesis chapter 8 is the story of Tamar. But to really understand that story, we need to back up to Genesis chapter 37. And some of you will remember back earlier this year, we did a series on the life of Joseph. And we talked about the fact that the story of Joseph was a little bit about the story of Judah, really, and how Joseph was able to keep Judah alive and to keep the line of Christ alive. And so this is the story that we're going back to in Genesis chapter 37. It's the story of Joseph, who was favored by his father Jacob to the dismay of his brothers, and they were jealous and they were envious. And one day he went to visit them, and they saw their chance, and they ripped his robe of many colors off him, and they threw him into a pit. And they were debating what they were going to do with them when some slave traders walked by, and Judah got the idea, hey, let's sell them. Let's sell them to these slave traders. And so that's what they did. They took their brother, their blood brother, and they sold him to these slave traders that were going by. And we're so used to that story that I don't think we pick up on the emotion of it. But can you imagine what it was like for Joseph? I'm sure he was probably bound as he's being dragged off by these slave traders, begging for his brothers to save him. And you can picture in that same time, Judah standing there like, good, I hope you suffer. Big time, buddy. And I am so glad to be done with you. And that's what sets up this story that we come to in Genesis chapter 38. So the Genesis chapter 38, instead of following Joseph off to Egypt, we follow Judah in the end of chapter 37 back home, where he reports to his father that, Joseph supposedly has been killed by a wild animal. Not true. But in Genesis chapter 38, we keep following Judah. And here's what we're told. We're told that he marries a wife, somebody that he evidently meets through his Canaanite friend by the name of Hira. So she's a Canaanite, probably not a God follower. We don't know her name. We only know that she was called the daughter of Shua. So he and the daughter of Shua, Judah and the daughter of Shua, they have a son. They name him They have another son. They name him Onan. And a little while later, they have a third son that they name Shelah. Judah decides it's time for to get married. So he goes and he finds a wife for this firstborn son, by the name of Tamar. Now, was a very wicked man, a very wicked son, and we're not told what he did or why he was called that, but so much so that God said, enough, and God killed him. And so is off the scene now, and Tamar is a widow. Well, this is where this levirate law comes into play, because by law in that time, Onan then was given, or Tamar was given to Onan, and he was to be the husband there. But Onan wasn't all excited about that idea, and Onan disrespects Tamar in the whole process, and God says, okay, that's wrong, and God kills him as well. And so Tamar has been married to husband number 1. He's gone, killed by God. Husband number 2, he's gone, killed by God. Well, this levirate law still is in place, and so she's supposed to be given to this third son, Shelah, who is evidently a little bit younger. Well, Judah looks at this whole situation and says, I married my son to this woman, and he dies. I marry my next son to this woman, and he dies. I'm not marrying my third son to her because I don't want to have a third funeral here to deal with. But the law said that he needed to, so this is what he did to get around it. He said, you know what, Tamar, my youngest son here, Shelah, he's younger, he's not quite of age to get married. You go live with your father, and when he has grown up a little bit more, then we'll have this marriage here. And so he sends Tamar back to live with her father, and he goes on with his life, and Shelah grows up, and it's time, he's age where he can get married, and Judah makes no effort whatsoever to marry this third son to Tamar. Well, what Judah has done here is he's completely abdicated his responsibility. Because even if they're going to wait for Shelah here, and he is being honest about it, he should have been taking care of her until that day came. Instead, he's like, you go back to your father. And so we see Tamar here. She's in a horrible situation. Socially, she's a widow. She's technically bound to this next son. There's nothing that can be done about that situation. She's financially not being taken care of by the person that should be taking care of her. And she is a victim, a huge victim of injustice. She's living like the worst life. And as you think back to that time too, because of the law of primogeniture, having a son and continuing on, that was the best thing that could happen to her. That wasn't going to happen. And so we have this woman who is a total victim, has very little rights, is in a horribly precarious state. What happens when her father's gone? So Tamar eventually realizes that Judah has no intention of marrying this Shelah off to her. And so she's like, you know what? I don't know what to do here. I've got to do something. And she hatches this plan. Well, this plan happens after Judah loses his wife. Again, we don't know her name. This is the daughter of Shua. But Judah has lost his wife. And so he's now a widower. But he's going down to a place called Timnah, where they're shearing sheep. And evidently this was kind of a big, I don't know if it's an annual event or a regular event, where the different men of the communities came together and they would shear these sheep. And Judah was on his way down there to shear those sheep. And Tamar says, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And she resorts to this absolutely horrible plan. But she decides that she's going to masquerade as a prostitute. And she meets Judah on the road. And sure enough, she knows what kind of person he is. Sure enough, he's interested. And so they negotiate a price. And the price is a young goat. But Judah's not traveling with the young goat. So he says, you know what? Here's what I'll do. I'll leave my staff and I'll leave my cord and I'll leave my signet behind here, and then I'll send the goat later. And she's like, okay, that's what we'll do. And this is the agreement that they come up with. And so the night progresses, and he goes on his way, and she goes on her way. Well, Judah goes back home, and he's like, I'd like to get those things back, and especially the signet, because that was kind of his identification and in his authority. It was like what you would roll across wax to seal something. So it's kind of like his signature. And he's like, I need to get those back. So he sends his friend Hiram down to find this woman. And he gets down to this Timnah, and he asks all around, I'm sure trying to be discreet, and everybody's like, we don't know who you're talking about. And so he goes back to Judah and says, I tried to find her, and I can't. And I guess Judah's like, well, I don't know. I don't know what to do now. I can't really give her the goat, but I don't have my stuff either. But then life goes on. Until news comes that his daughter-in-law, Tamar, is pregnant. And it's like in his mind, it's like, oh, I finally have vindication here. I thought she was evil. I mean, look at my first two sons, they were dead. And he finds out that she's pregnant, and she's supposed to be waiting for Shelah. She's supposed to be a widow, not involved with anybody else. And he becomes irate and says, okay, go get her. We're going to execute her. Whoa. That's pretty strong, isn't it? And so they go and they get her, and we pick up the story of Genesis 38, verse number 25. And if you're there, you can read along with me. If you're not there, I'll give you a second to get there. But Judah sees this woman as this problem, and he's going to finally he has his chance here to get rid of her, to move on from her. And he has cause now, right? Because she's been unfaithful to the family legacy. And we pick up the story here in verse number 25. Judah is sent for her, and as Tamar, is being brought out, and you can picture this scene. I want you to picture the scene of them dragging her to what should be her death. And as she's being brought out, she sends this message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And what does she hand them? But she hands them a cord and signet and staff. In this incredibly charged moment, she adds this, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. And this is this amazing plot twist, because in this moment, Judah is revealed as the culprit. He's revealed as the responsible party. And I like what Tim Keller says. He suggests that this reads even stronger in the Hebrew, but he says that this verse could read, see if you recognize the man whose seal and cord and staff these are. In other words, not do you recognize these items, but do you recognize yourself? Do you see the kind of person that you are? That you're the father here? Do you see the kind of person you are, that in your anger, you want to take her to her death? Do you see the kind of person who you are, who in your hypocrisy are railing against her immorality when you're just as guilty as the same thing? Do you recognize yourself for who you are? And Judah, I'm guessing there's a pause here, but Judah recognized these items and he said what? She is more righteous than I. Since I wouldn't give her son, or give her to my son Shelah, I wouldn't give her justice. And Judah is stopped in his tracks, but it's interesting what he says here. He doesn't say she is righteous, because she wasn't. And what she did was wrong, and what she did was like, ugh. And he's not vindicating her. What he says is this, she is more righteous than I am. If this case were to be tried in a court of law, I'm losing. And I get that. He merely said that her sin was less than his. She was not exonerated, but he realized that he was in no place to condemn her. So this is a story about justice for a woman who was living in a time when justice was hard to come by, at least for women. And that's probably a pattern that we see repeated throughout history, but it's a story of justice, and it's a story of vindication that God's somehow involved in. So we see in verse number 27, when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it to his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez, which means that, breakout. Then his brother who had the scarlet thread in his wrist came out, and he was named Zerah. And so these twins were born, and Perez, because his hand came out first, was deemed the firstborn. And he becomes the one that the line of Christ comes down. So even in this crazy, mixed up, sordid, kind of ick story, we see this triumph of the line of Christ. But here's my question, and I asked it to start with, and I want to ask it again. Why include this story? Why put Tamar's picture in the family album? Except for the fact that God wants us to learn some things from this story. And so what I want to look at as we finish up here this morning, let me give you 4 reasons why I believe that this story is included in the Christmas story. The first one is this. It's because the Christmas story is for outsiders. It's not just for Jews. Tamar was not a Jew. She was a Canaanite. The Christmas story isn't just for men either. Tamar was a woman. It wasn't just, and it isn't just for the perfect or for the rich or for the privileged. Tamar was a marginalized victim of injustice. This is a story for everyone because we are all outsiders. The gospel is God's story of good news. Not for the high and mighty. It's the story of good news for broken people. And maybe we can even see ourselves in the story of Tamar. Maybe you can identify with the outsiders. Maybe you've moved to a new community and weren't accepted. Maybe you were the kid in school that never had friends, that sat by himself at lunchtime. And maybe you've been the person when you went to work, nobody wanted anything to do with you. Maybe you were the single in a room full of married people. Maybe you were the person who was dealing with a situation in life that everybody's like, ugh. And maybe it's even like a physical handicap or something like that. And people just step away from you. And maybe you can relate to a woman who was being slighted and taken advantage of through no fault of her own, who was an outsider in so many ways. Maybe you can relate to that because that's the story of Christmas, that Jesus came for the outsiders. He gets this woman. As messed up as she is, he gets her and she gets his attention. And this is the story that we see repeated of Jesus as we go through the New Testament, through the Gospels. Jesus is always attracted to the outsiders. Who does he hang out with? Oh, the tax collectors. Nobody wants to be with them. Oh, the sinners. Oh, they're having a party. Oh, I'm going. Oh, there's Samaritans there. We walk around Samaria. Oh, no. I'm going to walk right there to that well in Samaria. Oh, and I'm going to meet a Samaritan woman. Oh, by the way, she's got some moral problems too. She's even an outcast among the Samaritans. And how about if I sit down and have a conversation with her? Because I'm all about the outsider. The lepers who were always pushed to the outside of town where they have to say, I'm unclean, I'm unclean, I'm unclean. Jesus says, hey, come here, let's talk. And let's change this situation. He was drawn to the outsiders. Who were the disciples? We find out that they were defined as what? Unlearned and ignorant men. And Jesus says, oh yeah, that's the one that I'm looking for. You're kind of on the outsider. How about the Christmas story itself? Who were the ones who were invited to the manger? The shepherds. Bottom rung of society, outsiders. If you couldn't do anything else, you could always be a shepherd. And they're invited to the story because Jesus is about the outsider. And this morning, if you feel like the outsider for whatever reason, like, you just can't penetrate that circle, that clique, whatever, you don't have to. Because the story is for outsiders. Secondly, the story is instructive. And justice matters. And God doesn't take justice lightly. And in this story, there's a woman who was suffering injustice, and she got some justice, but it's a reminder to all of us that justice matters. We need to keep our obligations and our commitments. We need to treat people the right way, especially those who are marginalized or defenseless. And we live in a society where there's a lot of people who are suffering injustice. There's a lot of people who are being marginalized. There are a lot of people who are like, okay, if you don't look like us, or if you don't talk like us, or if you don't have our same background or our same pedigree, sorry, you're not welcome in our stories. And Jesus is like, but you're welcome in mine. Because I'm about justice, and I'm about people being treated as people. And sometimes we look at people, and sometimes people in our world look at others as disposable and just in the way, or to be used, or they're just not appreciated. And Jesus says, oh, not me. I'm about justice, and I'm about that person who has suffered that injustice, and I'm about that person who is the cast out, and I'm about that person, and I'm going to make sure that that person receives justice. And maybe you've suffered an injustice in your life. Maybe you've been the victim of somebody else's lie, or you've been run over when somebody wanted something for himself, or you've been looked over or passed over. Somebody's always been chosen in front of you, and you're tempted to say, this isn't fair, and Jesus is like, this is who I came for. This is a story about injustice. Thirdly, it's a story that's redemptive. After this story in Genesis 38, we don't really hear about Tamar again. And so the narrative kind of moves on, except for the fact that God says, oh, let's pause here for a minute, and let's go back and let's be reminded of who Tamar was. Which I find fascinating. God takes this mess and he includes it in his family tree, and she's actually pointed out and in a sense honored as an ancestor of Jesus because he took her story and he made it better. And she became the mother of Perez, who was in the line of Christ. He took her story and he made sure that nobody would forget. He took her story and he included it in his story, but it wasn't because she was a good person. It's because he is a good God who redeems stories. And he redeemed her story of brokenness, outsider, injustice. And he says, oh, let me do something with your story. But it's the same thing for us. Hey, I don't know what your story is, but God looks at us, and it could be messed up, it could be broken, and it could be because you did the wrong thing. And there's no doubt here, Tamar did the wrong thing. And God says, I can use that story because I can redeem that story. You know what's interesting about this story is it's just not Tamar who's redeemed. It's Judah. Because the story goes on from Genesis 38 to Genesis 39, and eventually the story gets to where the sons of Jacob don't have any food, and so they're sent by their father down to Egypt to beg food, and they walk into a room, and unbeknownst to them, the person standing at the front of that room is who? It's Joseph, the brother that Judah sold as a slave. And he walks into that room, and Joseph, and we talked about this in that series that we did earlier, Joseph was kind of poking and prodding, like, who is my brother here? What is he like? Is he the same brother that he was before? And they go through all the, Jacob kind of like feels like playing these games with him, and eventually he ends up with Benjamin. He says, I'm going to throw Benjamin in the prison here. You guys can go back to your father. And what does Judah say? He says, put me in prison and send Benjamin back. My life for his. Is this the same guy that we see in Genesis 38? Nope. I think this is a guy who was confronted when he's handed this signet and this cord and this staff, and he's asked the question, who are you? And he looks at that and says, I'm not who I want to be. And God redeems his story. And maybe you can relate and identify to a situation where you've really messed things up, where your response to a situation was wrong, where a choice that you made was, well, you just wish you could do it over. You'd like to think you were more righteous, but honestly, You weren't at all. Well, this story is for you. And there's a fourth reason. It's because the story is to be continued. In the Christmas story, the genealogy, and we get to Christ, and in some ways we can say that the line ends there. But the Christmas story itself continues, and it continues for you, and it continues for me. Because Jesus came for the outsider. He came for the Gentile. He came for the broken. He came for the women. He came for the disenfranchised. He came for the desperate, for the victim of injustice. He came to bring dignity. He came to bring forgiveness. He even came for the perpetrator of injustice. He came to bring hope, and he came to continue your story. But let's be honest for a moment as we conclude. This is a story of redemption. It's an incredible story. Where God is saying, hey, don't miss this. Look what I did with this mess. So it's a story of redemption, but I think it also should be for us today a story of reflection. And I think we need to ask ourselves the same question that was asked of Judah. Do you recognize the person that you are? And so can we pause for a minute this morning just to stop and say, okay, who am I? I know who I want to be. I know who I try to pretend to be or pretend to be. But who am I really? How much is anger a part of my story? How much is secrecy a part of my story? How much is trying so hard to impress other people a part of my story? How much is dishonesty a part of my story? How much is self-righteousness a part of my story? How much is greed a part of my story? Who am I? Who am I? And that's the question for all of us this morning. It's the question that Tamar asked Judah. Who are you? It's the question that Christmas asks us, at least through this story. Who are you? Let's pray. So God, I wouldn't have put this story in there, but you did. And I'm grateful because I think that story gives us great encouragement and great challenge at the same time. Jesus, I'm so grateful for the fact that you came for the outsider. Because I'm one of them, and the people in this room, we're all outsiders. You came for the victim, and probably we were all victims. You also came for the perpetrator, and there's probably times in our lives too when, if we're completely honest, we're the source of injustice. We've treated others as less than we should. And Jesus, you still came for us. The story was continued because you came for us. So our head bowed, eyes closed this morning. I have two questions, and pretty similar to what I ask every single week. The first one is, have you ever trusted Jesus Christ? Have you ever been redeemed? Has your story been redeemed? Where you've taken the mess that you've made and you've given it to Jesus and let him take it for you on the cross and offer you forgiveness and freedom and hope? If you've never done that, I'd ask you this morning, I'd beg you this morning to invite Christ into your life, to give your life to him, to ask him to forgive you, to give you a new life. You can do that where you sit. Simple conversation between you and God. Between you and Jesus. Jesus, I know I have sinned. I have failed. I know who I am, but I believe that you are who you are. Please come into my life. If you're a Christ follower this morning, there's encouragement here, isn't there? And so I want you to be encouraged this morning, but I also want us to reflect and to be honest and to say, okay, who am I? Holy Spirit, I pray that you would reveal us to ourselves, as painful as that may be, so that at this Christmas we can become who you made us to be and who you want us to be. And so we commit our time, our study this morning, your word, your story, to you, and ask that you'd use it in our lives. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.